economic statistics in relationship to Canada and sort of left me open-mouthed in amazement at our dismal condition. So from what I've been able to understand, the richest people per capita in terms of GDP per person, gross domestic product per person, so that's total productivity, is Ontario. And Ontario inhabitants are now poorer per capita than inhabitants of Mississippi, and that's the poorest American state. So the inhabitants of Canada's richest province are poorer than the inhabitants of the United States' poorest state. And that's actually occurred primarily in the last 10 years.
Yes.
And because we were basically at parity before that.
Yes.
And had historically been not quite as rich as the Americans, with some, blips above them, but pretty much tracking them one-to-one.
Yeah.
And now it's 60%, something like that. And that's not all the bad news, because it's 60% in terms of absolute wealth, and a real estate market that's twice as expensive approximately on average.
Yeah.
Right. So now
it's really bad. It's really incredible. Like 10 years ago, the New York Times wrote an article, "Welcome to Canada, we're home of the world's most affluent middle class." And in that article, the Times had calculated that median American and Canadian incomes were tied, and that Canadians were slightly better off. Now, part of that was because of the 08-09 financial crisis hit them harder than it hit us, but still. Now, per capita GDP in the States is $22,000 higher than in Canada, measured in USD. So that's about almost 30,000 measured in.
Right, so that's a whole other income, essentially.
Yes.
That's a whole other part-time income.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, as you correctly point out, their real estate is significantly cheaper than ours. So their dollars go a lot further, even when you match up the exchange rates. And what's worse than that is that the leading indicators are even more horrific. And leading indicators, for example, are investment dollars, because your wealth tomorrow is determined by your investment today. So if your employer, for example, is buying lots of new tools and technology, you're going to be able to crank out more widgets. So you crank out those widgets, then you can ultimately make more income down the road. If you take business investment and divide it by the number of workers, the American worker gets $28,000 of investment measured in US dollars.
This is per capita?
Per worker.
Or per year?
Per worker, per member of the labor force.
Okay.
So you take the total business investment of the United States divided by the total number of workers in America, it's 28 grand. In Canada, it's 15 grand. So the Canadian worker gets about 55 cents for every dollar of his American, and they're both measured in USD. So how is the Canadian worker?
That's investment in future productivity?
That's investment in machines, in technology, in warehouses, factories.
I see.
Any capital investment that businesses make divided by the number of workers, that's the measurement. So now that means they're getting better technology, better new machines, better tools than our workers, and they will be able to crank out even greater wages for their people than we will, unless we catch up with that. Our productivity is another major problem. Right now, and that's productivity sounds complicated. It's actually extremely simple. You just take the GDP and you divide it by the hours worked in the country. So American GDP is $80. So for every hour an American worker works, on average, he or she produces $80 of GDP. In Canada, it's 50. So that's every hour. So that means we have to work 60% more just to make the same amount and have the same level of income to buy food and housing. So now that sounds like a bunch of wonk speak that might seem like it only matters to someone staring at a spreadsheet or a graph or a chart. But in fact, that's reflected in the fact that our 2 million people are lined up at food banks because they can't afford food, and 80% of youth can't afford homes. And our quality of life and the things we can afford to provide our kids have fallen back so much.
Well,
There's
it's a
real
pretty
life.
stark and easily comprehensible statistic.
Yeah.
I mean, if you work and you produce $80 worth of goods and services in an hour
Yeah.
compared to working and producing 50, obviously that's a substantial shortfall.
Yeah.
So, and is there a starker indicator of the economic disparity between the US and Canada than that? Or do you think that's the primary statistic?
I mean, I think housing costs
Yeah.
are another one. I
Right,
mean,
right.
there was a study out just 10 days ago that has Toronto and Vancouver now by far the most unaffordable housing markets in North America. And so, you know, housing costs are 50% higher in Toronto than they are in Chicago, even though Chicago workers make 50% more money. The same is true between Vancouver and Seattle. Seattle workers make way more than Vancouver workers, but housing is 60 or 70% more expensive in Vancouver. So on
Right,
all
so we're
the
making
measures,
less by a lot.
Yes.
By a lot.
by a lot.
Yeah.
And we're
30%,
paying
we're
more.
paying more by a lot.
Yeah.
Right. And most of that's transpired in the last 10 years.